Well, many thanks to Halifax Civic Trust, and particular to Mark and to Alan, and also to the Albany Club for hosting this, providing such an amazing venue. And thanks particularly to Bert, who provided the heater, so the key bit. And also thanks to Rachel, who's not only doing the recording, but is also managing the bookstore, which you might like to look at the end. I'm going to talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then, as Alan says, we'll go into a Q&A, which is always the best bit, because you have your chance to ask whatever questions, and then we'll have a refreshment break and book signing. So, question: how many of you watched any of Gentleman Jack? Right. I'd say that was a big majority. How many of you watched all episodes, which is I'd say that's a good, I'd say that's about 55%, 60%. Anybody read anything, any books about Anne Lister? Oh, it's a good half or so. So that's great. Well, this is, I think, my most controversial talk on Anne Lister. And I've given quite a few. Because here are two rival claims about Anne Lister. Was she an arch-traditionalist, and/or was she the first modern lesbian? And is it possible to reconcile these two rival claims? Anne Lister, let's start off with arch-traditionalist. Somebody put it to me recently, trying to be witty. Anne Lister was someone who had children working for her down her coal mines. Yep, that's true. But also, she had quite conservative loyalty to the Church of England, and linked to this die-hard political allegiance to the Blues, to the Tories, soon to become the Conservatives at elections. This traditionalist claim had long historical roots in terms of how it was recorded. And we go back to her descendant, John Lister. I think everyone knows of John Lister. Yep. Who in the 1880s, so good 40 years after Anne Lister's death, had a series in the Halifax Weekly Guardian. And it was a long series. It ran each week over 5 years at least, transcribing large sections of her diaries, and of John Lister and that Guardian series a bit more later. Much more recent is the claim that Anne Lister was the first modern lesbian. It comes from an American LGBT historian called Richter Norton. Anyone come across his name? In Halifax? Or anywhere? No. Well, we're going to hear quite a bit about Richter Norton. He wrote an article in 2003, so that's exactly 20 years ago, in which he made this claim in the title of his article, though I would argue without providing an awful lot of evidence to back up his claim. And his words caught on, especially after Gentleman Jack was shown in particularly UK and America. Journalists, desperate for a catchy headline, and my goodness, they were desperate for a catchy headline then, grasped gratefully for Richter Norton's words. And I'd add, from my experience, the less that writer or journalist knew about Anne Lister, the less they'd read, the more they grasped for Richter Norton's title, because it was easy, it was catchy, it was memorable. Usually they put the words in their title in quotation marks, because then, if anybody said, oh no, it's not true, then they as a professional journalist could say, oh, I was only quoting, and they wouldn't be taken to court, as it were. So which of these two claims is more accurate? Or can we be both an arch-traditionalist and a first modern lesbian? And I hope to tussle out these two claims with you this afternoon. Just to check again, can everyone hear okay? Anyone finding it a bit of a struggle? Good, brilliant. Let's first of all just remind us who these two men were, John Lister and Richter Norton. John Lister needs little introduction, particularly if you live in Halifax. He was the last Lister to inherit Shibden Hall. he was obviously an indirect descendant of Anne Lister, and it was he who cracked Anne Lister's secret impenetrable code around 1892. And if you'd like to read more of the story, Rachel has copies of Presenting the Past. It's the yellow one on the bookstall. But his politics were totally unlike his ancestors. He'd moved leftwards from the Liberal Party, left, and even joined Keir Hardie's ILP, Independent Labour Party. So what would Anne Lister have thought of that? Heaven knows. And indeed, he decided to open his Halifax Guardian series, based, as we know, on his transcripts of large chunks of the Anne Lister diaries, with the 1837 election. And in the 1837 election, Anne Lister was very energetic, doorstepping her tenants around the Shibden estate who had the vote. For John Lister, she was a political traditionalist. And I'll just give you one example, and there's lots of others, as to how he saw her as a traditionalist compared to him. Anne Lister took a robust view, and that's perhaps a polite word, a robust view of trespassers at Shibden Hall. There was talk of legal notices and prosecution and lawyers and all that sort of stuff. While, by contrast, John Lister opened up Shibden Parkland to the public in 1925, and there's photographs to confirm that. So that's just shortly before he died in 1933. Richter Norton, we know, is less well known. Nobody in this room has come across his name or read anything. And certainly when I was working on Anne Lister's diaries in the 1990s, I'd not heard of him at all, though he was, I now discover, writing. He's an American LGBT historian, born in New York, educated in Florida, where he campaigned for GLF, Gay Liberation Front, and then in 1973 moved to London, becoming a freelance writer for, of course, Gay News. He couldn't be more different from John Lister of Shibden Hall. John Lister's homosexuality, if that is what we think was the case, which I think probably was circumscribed by the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, which harshened the law in Britain against homosexual activity by men. Of course, for Richter Norton, the atmosphere and legal context was very different. Richter Norton's focus is queer history, especially 18th and 19th century England, including, of course, lesbian history. So let's look at what he actually has to say. His article, the main article for us, is Anne Lister, the First Modern Lesbian, which was published in Lesbian History in 2003. And he persuasively asserts that Anne Lister, and I quote, "She possessed a fully formed lesbian personality whose characteristics are easily recognizable as to modern lesbians. Her awareness of herself as a lesbian, though of course she did not use that word, situated her within a lesbian culture." And then Norton adds, "This is the authentic voice of lesbian experience, worth more than a dozen volumes of abstract queer theory." And any of us who've had to read queer theory in any volume know that's certainly the case. Anne Lister's most quoted statement on this, and it's quoted by Richter Norton too, is, and I know you all know these words, "I love and only love the fairer sex, and beloved of them in turn my heart revolts from any other love but theirs. I love and only love the fairer sex, and beloved by them in turn my heart revolts from any other love but theirs." 1821. But how could Anne Lister identify other like-minded women? Her key way of identifying them was to quote Latinate classical texts and judge their reaction. So I'll give you an example from 2 years later, 1823. She wrote, "Miss Pickford has read the 6th satire of Juvenal. She understands these matters well enough. And Juvenal's satire was classical text, including male and female homosexuality. Frustratingly, Richter Norton provides almost no references, yet anyone who's read Helena Whitbread's early books on the early Anne Lister, has anybody read any of them? Either of them? Yeah, quite a few. Will instantly recognise some of his words, but he doesn't cite his sources. Bad. And sadly, Richter Norton gives no indication of what Anne Lister had written in code and what she had written in her ordinary handwriting. I mean, his excuse was, fair enough, that at the time of his writing, 2003, Helena Whitbread herself didn't distinguish between code and handwriting. And in the later edition, which is 2010, she does, which is very helpful for us readers. Richter Norton also notes that Anne Lister behaved very discreetly in general society. He gives another example, 1824, so it's another later year, when Anne Lister was visiting Paris, talking with a Mrs. Barlow, who becomes her lover. Mrs. Barlow, and again I quote, Mrs. Barlow asks what her, Anne Lister's maidservant, thinks of her behaviour. Anne Lister replied, "Oh, merely that I have my own particular ways." I happen to say that my aunt, who Anne was very close to, my aunt often said I was the oddest person she had ever known. The oddest person she had ever known. Mrs. Barlow said, "But she knows all about it, does she not?" "Oh," I said. "Oh," said I, "she and my friends are all in a mist about it." So, what we can think is, particularly after the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, the social attitudes to lesbians compared to male homosexuality, which was illegal, was very different. Anne Lister's aunt, in Anne Lister's lifetime, could talk about misty or being vague, where there's nothing vague much about the laws pertaining to male homosexuality. Richter Norton was certainly very perceptive. However, he had apparently not read the Anne Lister diaries in the original, then available in the archives in Halifax, albeit on microfilm. Anybody remember microfilm? Yeah. We're quite glad you don't have to use it much anymore. And surely Halifax isn't such a long journey from London, but he doesn't seem to have come up here. Nor does he seem to have a close grasp of the social history. He says Anne Lister was a member of the petit bourgeoisie. Well, kind of at the very beginning, until about 1815. She did live a bit of a middle-class life through her parents. But in 1815, as you know, when she was in her 20s, she was adopted by her unmarried aunt and unmarried uncle to go and live with them at ancient Shibden Hall. So she became, by adoption, a member of the minor landed gentry. And on the death of her uncle James in 1826, she inherited Shibden estate. But sadly, Richter Norton apparently hadn't read Female Fortune, which came out 5 years, and I emphasise 5 years, before he wrote his article in 1998. So again, not much of an excuse, because he ends his article asserting, and I quote, "In 1832, she begins an affair with 29-year-old Anne Walker, a rich heiress. Yes, true, all true so far, who became her living companion." Not, I don't think, actually the words we use. Because in Female Fortune, I quite clearly state that by taking communion together at Goodham Gate Church in York, Easter 1834, this was seen by Anne Lister in particular as a way to sanctify their union. After all, lesbian marriage was recognised by neither the church nor the state, and a religious act, a religious ceremony, was available to them. And as Anne Walker had said, it's to be as good as a marriage, and Anne Lister says quite as good or better. So they take communion together at Goodham Gate Church in York in 1834. So I think Richter Norton has taken us a very useful step forward, but he was reliant on secondary sources, which always give you a bit of a distance from what you're writing about. And he does quote quite extensively from Helena Whitbread's books without really acknowledging them, which is a bit sloppy, I think. However, he had, I suggest, failed to convince readers like me of his claim that she was the first modern lesbian. And we do notice that even Richter Norton himself began to have growing doubts. Just 2 years later, 2005, in an anthology called Homosexuality in 18th Century England, he reported on the ladies of Llangollen, two women who'd lived a generation earlier than Anne Lister. And Richter Norton cites a London newspaper article published in 1790, so this is a year before Anne Lister was even born, and it's titled Extraordinary Female Affection, and it tells the story of Lady Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. So who were these ladies of Llangollen? Well, the London newspaper article tells us they were daughters of great Irish families, and they certainly seemed well connected. They seemed to know the right people at the time. And the newspaper article goes on to say, they bear a strange antipathy to the male sex. Indeed, Butler rejected offers of conventional marriage and even eloped with Ponsonby in 1778. And they went to a remote valley in North Wales where they lived together very modestly, though they did have a number of eminent visitors coming to pay their respects. They lived modestly on small annuities, and we're told they lived in neatness, elegance and taste. Neatness, elegance and taste. Okay so far, but a few days after this article, another London newspaper reported on them more briefly, calling them two female hermits and speculating as to their connection. And we might dwell on this word connection because it did carry definite sexual innuendo, and it could include ties by marriage. So just hang on to that word connection. So had they been outed even in the distant parts of rural North Wales, rather as a way, and we'll come to this later, and Lister and Anne Walker were in a sense outed by the Leeds Mercury in 1835, which said, we beg to congratulate the parties on their happy connection. I'll return to this. So the ladies of Llangollen seem to be in some despair because it's socially embarrassing. You know, they behave so well, socially embarrassing. So they appealed to, you go for the top politician, the most eminent politician you know, Edmund Burke, no less, for legal advice on libel, and he had lawyers in his family. He was very sympathetic to their cause, condemning the writers as, I quote, the most wicked of all wretches, the most wicked of all wretches, for this shocking license. But he did warn them that trying to prove libel was extremely difficult, and he advised them instead that their, quote, piety, good sense and fortitude, plus their isolated rural retreat, will enable you to despise the scandals of the newspapers. Time passed, in fact 32 years passed, and the rural gentry respectability of the ladies of Llangollen had attracted the attention of the ladies of Shibden, that is, Anne Lister and her aunt. Anne Lister was particularly fascinated, and they visited Llangollen in July 1822. The ladies of the Llangollen were, as we'd imagine, elderly by then, but Anne Lister, who has a very powerful imagination, is thinking all the time about the possibility of, or whether there's a possibility of her living with Mariana, then her lover, but sadly, from her point of view, conventionally married to the landowner Charles Norton. And Anne Lister says in her diary, and I'm going to quote the code, "It excited me, a sort of peculiar interest tinged with melancholy. A sort of peculiar interest tinged with melancholy. I could have mused for hours, dreamt dreams of happiness, conjured up many a vision of hope." They returned after this visit to Llangollen to Shibden, and Anne Lister wrote to Mariana about the ladies of Llangollen, and Mariana replied in her letter, which Anne Lister transcribes in code. Tell me if you think their regard has always been platonic. I cannot help thinking that surely it was not platonic. Heaven forgive me, but I look within myself and doubt. I feel the infirmity of our nature and hesitate to pronounce such attachments uncemented by something more tender still than friendship. And hesitate to pronounce such attachments uncemented by something more tender still than friendship. So Helena Whitbread, in her 1988, that was the first book, recorded the importance of this visit to the ladies of Llangollen, which has so excited Anne Lister's imagination. And of course, this was taken up by other more recent lesbian historians. In 1993, Emma Donoghue, anyone come across Emma Donoghue? Yep. Irish writer, quite celebrated now, living in Canada, and by Terry Castle. Castle was a professor at Stanford University in America. And Castle chastised those who had earlier, of the ladies of Llangollen, emblematized them as depressingly chaste. So they almost became the official mascots of the no sex before 1900 school. No sex before 1900 school, as exemplified by the ladies of Llangollen. Castle added of the 1790 newspaper report, and I quote, "In this exceptional text, romantic passion between women is seen as similar to heterosexuality, leading to elopement, and even to rivaling it. But of course, unlike Anne Lister, there was no detailed daily diary, and certainly no detailed daily diary written partly in code, so, as far as we know. So we know less about the ladies of Llangollen. However, I suggest the implication of the ladies of Llangollen example in North Wales is that Anne Lister was not the first modern lesbian, and we'll come back to that a bit later on. So let's return to our second question. How much of a traditionalist was Anne Lister, and was she indeed an arch-traditionalist? This is a much easier question to answer, because the wording makes no comparative claims she was the most traditional or even the last traditional lesbian. Rather, it's easy to answer because evidence of traditional practices are threaded right the way through Anne's daily diaries, which, don't let's forget, stretched over 35 years, from 1806 when she was 15 to 1840, and comprising nearly 5 million words. Almost every page has something that says that is a traditional practice, much of it in code. She was very traditional with the world that she occupied and the world she valued so highly. So let's start with social class. Anne's inherited ancient inherited acres after the death of her uncle James in 1826 illuminate this very clearly and very powerfully. She did see industry and manufacturing growing all around her, especially in Halifax after the canal extension arrived in 1828. She noted it, but she kept it at a distance, preferably out of sight from Shibden's ancient and elegant windows. Rather, she valued landed interest above all else. Land mattered a lot, as did the list of the family dynastic claim to Shibden, stretching back for a good 2 centuries. And central to Anne Lister's worldview was wills, inheritance, and settlement property within the family, with many visits to her lawyer, whose office was just outside the Peace Hall. From land ownership and its traditions flowed religion and its traditions. Anne Lister was, of course, a devout and observant Anglican. More than her actual parents, her biological parents, who she saw as really disappointingly middle class. Up at Shibden, it was her Uncle James who became her godfather, and Aunt Anne who became her godmother, who were much more like parents to her in her adulthood and were hugely significant to her. Likewise, church attendance on Sundays was obligatory. It was in the afternoon somehow. And if unable to attend church, like at the end of her Aunt Anne's life, when Aunt Anne was bedridden, prayers would be read at her bedside by Anne Lister and Anne Walker, then living at Shibden, with the women servants in attendance. The Reverend Musgrave, vicar of the large and prosperous parish of Halifax, which stretched for miles, was a key figure. His income rested heavily on his traditional right to collect tithes. William Priestley, who lived in Lightcliffe and happened to be Anne Walker's older cousin, wanted to reform this archaic practice, but Anne Lister resisted such progressive notions. And far worse than even William Priestley, far worse still, were of course the nonconformists, especially the Methodists, with their progressive notions, with rumours of their preaching radical sermons in their chapels and supporting dangerous new ideas which were beginning to coagulate into what we call Chartism and Chartist ideas and Chartist demands. Terrible. This takes us neatly onto politics. It was inconceivable that either Anne Lister or Anne Walker would support any party other than the Blues. And Walker, as you know, had inherited half of the Crownest estate in Lightcliffe, and it's much bigger and much more lucrative than the traditional Shibden estate. They supported the Blues at elections, the Tories we might call them, and was soon to be called the Conservative Party. Did it matter that women had no parliamentary vote? Nope, not at all. No way. Because after all, it was going to be another generation before the Secret Ballot Act was actually passed. So everybody knew how you voted. So with no secret ballot, as landowners, Anne Walker and Anne Lister would doorstep, and I literally mean doorstep, on the doorstep, their tenants who had the vote, male tenants who had the vote, persuading them forcibly to vote blue. This was usually very effective, as the poll books for the two constituencies were concerned with Halifax and the West Riding constituency for 1835 and 37 confirmed. Has anyone looked at these poll books? One or two people. After all, just imagine you're a small tenant. You may be renting 7 acres from Anne Lister or Anne Walker, and you're on annual lease, so you have to go down every year down to probably Robert Parker, the lawyer, just outside the Peace Hall, sign an annual lease, and you've got a family to support. What do? You haven't really got much option, have you? And finally, and this is sort of beginning to challenge her complete traditionalism, Anne Lister was, of course, an adventurous intellectual. If a new book sounded interesting, and many did, she soon grabbed it and read it. She'd either go to the Halifax Library, which was a private library in the town centre, or to the bookshop. And she read things, she's got quite a scientific sort of mind. She read stuff about steam power and steam engines, and with Anne Walker even ventured briefly onto some railway journeys. But she remained essentially at heart of the canal generation, and she only very reluctantly sold her canal navigation shares when she could see they were being challenged by the railways. She's got a good financial head on her shoulders, and she opted to travel by carriage, one of their carriages with Anne Walker when, for example, they went travelling. She was absolutely fascinated by cutting-edge geology. Where was Charles Darwin at this time? On the Beagle, sailing the seas. Young Charles Darwin, sort of half a generation younger than Anne Lister, was sailing the seas on the Beagle, so his new ideas, newfangled ideas, hadn't come home to the UK yet. But any newfangled ideas that began to challenge or even question the origins of the world as told in the Bible could not be tolerated by Anne Lister. In that sense, she was a traditionalist. Historians of homosexuality have explored Anne Lister's world, living a lesbian life and living a lesbian marriage in Halifax in the 1830s. But fewer have explored her traditionalism and what that meant in terms of living her lesbian life. One of the very few is the outstanding scholar Alan Bray. Anyone come across him? One or two, a minority. His book, The Friend, was published, ironically, in the same year as Richter Norton's key article, 2003. But they could not be more different. Bray wrote about how the bodies of two male friends, and he gives a Cambridge example from the late 17th century, two bodies of two male friends might be, for example, buried in the same tomb or in the same church vault. And he traces this practice even further back to the 15th century, and he does mainly give male examples. He goes on to admit that by the 1830s, which is the decade we're particularly looking at, and the world that Anne Lister inhabited then, this religious tradition was slipping away. So evidence of it was becoming fragmentary, growing ever fainter as their world disappeared. But, Bray suggests, traces were still visible if one looked for them. And his close reading of My Female Fortune, which was out by then, by 2003, led him to write of the Anne Lister diaries, and I quote, "There stands out in unmistakable detail the degree to which a settled friendship could still be comprehended by family and friends in the 1830s as creating bonds that overlapped with and shaded into those created by marriage. They had only faded from view." Let's read that again. "There stands out in unmistakable detail the degree to which a settled friendship could still be comprehended by family and friends in the 1830s as creating bonds that overlapped with and shaded into those created by marriage. They had only faded by view." And this reminds us of the quotation, it's in Nature's Domain from 1832, of the Anne Lister and Walker conversation during the wooing and seduction. "Their liaison would," Anne Walker suggests, and I quote obviously in the code, "as good as a marriage." "Yes," Anne Lister replied, "quite as good as, or better." And then that evening, Anne Lister had confided in her beloved aunt about Anne Walker, and she says her aunt seemed very well pleased with my choice and prospects. She thought my father would be pleased if he knew, and so would both my uncles. Her aunt, Anne Lister, seemed very well pleased at my choice and prospects. She thought my father would be pleased if he knew, and so would both my uncles. The tricky thing about both my uncles is they were both dead. They were both absolutely and completely dead. One had died in 1817, the one who lived in Northgate House, as was, and Uncle James in 1826. So I find this phrasing very kind of revealing. I think I do. Bray then follows the two women to Goodrham Gate Church, York, Easter 1834, where they could make their decided promise. Its form, Bray suggests, recalls directly and in the most concrete terms the forms of solemnization their union. This solemnization was, and I quote, "as two sworn brothers out of the 15th century might have done." For sanctifying their union was understood as the ties of marriage. And indeed, Bray even goes on to suggest, and I quote, and this is where I actually raised my eyebrows when I was reading this for the first time. Bray goes on to suggest, it is as if one had found the 15th century alive and well and living in the large and prosperous parish of Halifax. Found the 15th century alive and well and living in the large and prosperous and industrialising parish of Halifax. As I suggested, the ladies of Llangollen were very rarely publicly mocked for their sexuality, and likewise Anne Lister. A key instance, I suggest, and you know this if you've read Female Fortune, was after the January 1835 election. The Tories had won one of the Halifax seats by using very dubious means, and angry West Riding Whigs, so Whigs soon to become Liberals from all around the area, deployed sexual innuendo to warn Anne Lister and Anne Walker off from any more political door-stopping in future elections. There was a newspaper paragraph announcing their marriage, and then an anonymous letter addressed to Captain Tom Lister arrived at Shibden, and it said, "We beg to congratulate the parties on their happy connection." We beg to congratulate the parties on their happy connection. And we come to the same word, connection, with a sexual innuendo and also implying some connection through marriage. And it's the same word as was used by the newspaper article so many decades earlier of the ladies of Llangollen. So, Bray argues, the portrait of Lister's sexuality that emerges from the frame of her religion is markedly less modern, less radical, and the terms Anne Lister used for her union with Anne Walker, and before that with Maria Belcombe and others, have an antiquity to them, So, has Bray's interpretation caught on at all? Well, if we judge by a well-informed audience today, not at all. It's largely been lost. It's not really caught on in the way that Richter Norton's first modern lesbian claim has. Jeanette Winterson, who some of you will know as a feminist writer, wrote a blurb for the 2010 edition of Helena Whitbread's first book. She wrote, "And Lister's sense of self and self-awareness is what makes her modern to us." However, other recent lesbian scholars like Chris Rawson, who's a Canadian academic, in 2013, so 3 years later, wrote in the Journal of Lesbian Studies an article. Lister turns, and I quote, "Lister turns towards the past that remains intimately connected to her sexual identity and her gender presentation." So some lesbian historians are beginning to sort of adopt the Alan Bray rather than Victor Norton line. But I would suggest that since the impact of Gentleman Jack, and how many people said they'd watched an episode? Almost everybody. Since the impact of Gentleman Jack, both in this country and Western Europe and in America and Canada, from 2019 onwards, the easy popular headline of "And Lister was the first modern lesbian" persists and is all over the place. And I even found it in a headline from the National Archives. So that just goes to show how how pervasive and persuasive it has become. So let's end by returning to the original question. Was Anne Lister the first modern lesbian or arch-traditionalist? I presented evidence from the diaries that she was a traditionalist, and I hope I persuaded you of that, and probably even arch-traditionalist, in that she sought confirmation of her sexual nature not in modernity nor in the future, but in the past, both the recent past of her two late uncles, or, as Bray suggests, from the 15th century about burial practices, or in the distant classical past of antiquity to Juvenal, for she believed her nature was God-given. So was there any sense in which Anne Lister was the first modern lesbian? My own feeling is that the sole basis for this claim was not her living a lesbian life, but her magnificent diaries, internationally recognised, as you know, by UNESCO in 2011. Anne Lister's use of a secret code to confide in her diaries, rather she confided in God, her nature and lesbian desire and lesbian sexual practice ensured privacy. And no one, as far as I'm aware, no one has written such a detailed daily record of living a lesbian life before, and giving details of what lesbian sexual relationships between lesbians was like. I believe that it is the American scholar Kat Euler. Anybody come across her? Yep, one or two. Who studied for a PhD. She was a PhD student in York in the 1990s, and I had the privilege of working with her, and we gave some talks at women's history conferences then. And she finished her PhD, and it's in 1995, and you can get it up online, which is really helpful. She's American, and she, after teaching a bit in higher education in Britain, she went back and became a professor at the University of Arizona. Kat Euler, for me, is the only person who's really found, in her own words, I think, the most perceptive and accurate phrasing of identifying the ways in which Anne Lister was indeed the first modern lesbian, the only way. Euler says, with scrupulous honesty, I think, of the diaries, they are, and I quote, the earliest known non-fiction first-person account of lesbian sexuality, and that she, Euler, is unaware of anything similar elsewhere on the planet, not just the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, but the whole planet. And I agree with this statement. I definitely go along with that. So for me, Anne Lister, arch-traditionalist, wrote for us the first known, candid, first-person, intimate daily narrative of living a lesbian life, which is available to us now in the 21st century in the UK and elsewhere. So thank you, Anne Lister of Shibden Hall. Long may you and your magnificent diaries survive and thrive and live here in Halifax in West Yorkshire. The end.